Eleanor Ashworth had learned in the space of a single evening that the distance between hope and despair could be crossed in the time it took a man to raise a glass of champagne, and 3 years later she still carried that lesson like a stone lodged beneath her ribs, a weight she had grown so accustomed to that she sometimes forgot it was there until moments like this one, standing at her bedroom window in the grey light of a spring morning, watching rain streak down the glass and pool on the sill, the gardens of Briarwood spread before her in all their overgrown neglect, and she pressed her right thumb against the inside of her left wrist, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin, as if to remind herself that she was still here, still breathing, still enduring. The Hartwell ball had been in late spring as well, she remembered, though the weather had been fine that night, the air sweet with the scent of hothouse flowers that drifted through the open doors of the ballroom, and she had worn her best gown, a pale rose silk that her mother had worn before her, and she had believed with the foolish certainty of a girl of 20 that Lord Clarence Pemberton would declare himself before the evening ended. She had watched him across the room, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight, his pale blue eyes finding hers with what she had been certain was meaning. And when he had excused himself to speak with a group of gentlemen near the refreshment table, she had drifted closer, her heart beating so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, already composing in her mind the letter she would write to her father, already imagining the relief in his eyes when she told him she would be a viscountess. She had been close enough to hear every word, close enough to see the way Clarence's lips curved as he spoke, the casual cruelty of his smile as he declared to his companions that the Ashworth girl had served her purpose well enough, that a man must have options while pursuing a true prize, that surely no one believed he would actually marry so far beneath his station when £40,000 and a baron's daughter awaited him in Miss Arabella Kingsley. She remembered the laughter, the clink of glasses raised in toast to his engagement, the cold shock that had rooted her feet to the marble floor even as her face burned with humiliation. She remembered fleeing to the terrace, the stones icy beneath her thin slippers, the way she had pressed herself against the balustrade and willed herself not to weep where anyone might see. 3 years had passed since that night, 3 years of whispers following her through ballrooms, 3 years of watching other girls receive proposals while she stood along the wall with the dowagers and the wallflowers, her grey eyes darkening with each season that passed without an offer. Her father's health had declined, his fortune dwindling with it, and Eleanor had watched her dreams of love wither like the white camellias that had once bloomed in her mother's garden, now nothing but bare earth and memory. She had stopped hoping. It was, she had discovered, the only way to survive. The rain had not ceased by afternoon, and Eleanor descended the stairs to find her father in his study, a room that had once smelled of leather bindings and the pleasant mustiness of well-loved books, but now carried the sharper scent of pipe tobacco and something else, something she could not name but recognized nonetheless as the particular fragrance of worry, of sleepless nights, spent poring over columns of figures that refused to balance no matter how many times one added them. Samuel Ashworth sat behind his desk, surrounded by papers and ledgers that seemed to have multiplied in the weeks since she had last ventured into this room, and when he looked up at her entrance, she saw that his hands were trembling, a fine tremor that he tried to still by pressing his palms flat against the mahogany surface, and she knew before he spoke that whatever news he had to share would not be good. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice cracked on her name, "I had hoped to spare you this, but I find I cannot carry it alone any longer." She crossed to him, her grey eyes darkening with concern as she took the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she had sat as a child while he read to her from volumes of poetry and history. And she folded her hands in her lap and waited, because she had learned in these 3 years since the Hartwell ball that there was a dignity in stillness, a strength in allowing others to find their words without rushing them. "The estate is mortgaged," he said, and each word seemed to cost him something precious. "The debts have mounted beyond what I can manage, and we face ruin within the year." He told her then of the failed investments, the tenant rents that had not covered the repairs needed after the harsh winter, the creditors who had been patient but whose patience had finally worn thin, and as he spoke, Eleanor felt the stone beneath her ribs grow heavier, pressing against her heart until she thought she might not be able to breathe. "I have failed you in fortune, my dear," her father said, and his eyes, so like her own, glistened with tears he would not let fall. "But never in love. Never in that." Eleanor rose and moved around the desk to kneel beside his chair, taking his trembling hands in her own steady ones, and she spoke of practical things, of positions she might take as a governess or companion to some wealthy family, of the skills she possessed that might be of use. And she did not allow her voice to waver, even as something inside her quietly shattered at the thought of leaving Briarwood, of leaving the garden where her mother's camellias had once bloomed, of becoming a stranger in someone else's house. Her father protested, as she had known he would, but she pressed on, insisting she would rather work than be a burden, and they were still speaking of possibilities when Mrs. Beckett appeared in the doorway, her weathered face uncertain, holding a letter that had arrived by express messenger. Samuel Ashworth took it with hands that shook more violently now, broke the seal of dark green wax, and read. And Eleanor watched the colour drain from his face as he read it again, his lips moving silently over words she could not see. Without speaking, he handed it to her, and she took the heavy cream paper and saw the signature at the bottom before she read anything else. Frederick Thornton, Duke of Ashford. The words above that signature were businesslike, almost cold in their precision, speaking of requirements and observations and suitability, and yet they contained within them an offer that made Eleanor's hands tremble so violently that the paper crackled between her fingers. An offer of marriage, an offer to settle all her father's debts, an offer that would save everything and everyone she loved. Extended by a man she had met exactly twice in her life, and could barely remember beyond an impression of height and darkness, and eyes that had seemed to look through her rather than at her. Eleanor did not sleep that night, though she lay in her narrow bed with the covers drawn to her chin, and her eyes fixed on the ceiling where shadows moved like restless spirits in the guttering candlelight, and she turned the Duke's letter over in her mind, as one might turn a strange coin found in the garden, examining every edge and surface for some clue to its origin and meaning. She knew so little of Frederick Thornton, Duke of Ashford, that she might as well have received a proposal from a figure in a painting, a stern-faced ancestor staring down from a gilded frame, with eyes that revealed nothing of the soul behind them. What she did know came in fragments, pieces of gossip overheard at assemblies and whispered behind fans, that he had married young, a love match by all accounts, and that his wife had died in childbed along with the son she had tried to give him, that he had retreated from society entirely after the tragedy, his London townhouse shuttered, his seat in Parliament empty, his name spoken less and less frequently, until he had become something of a ghost, a title without a presence, that those who had encountered him in recent years spoke of a man transformed, cold where he had once been warm, silent where he had once been charming, his green eyes holding all the welcome of a winter forest. She remembered seeing him twice, both times at large gatherings where she had been too insignificant to warrant his attention, and he too remote to invite anyone's approach. A tall figure, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, standing apart from the crowd with a glass of wine he never seemed to drink, leaving before the dancing began. She had thought him proud. She had thought him forbidding. She had not thought of him at all, really, until this letter had arrived to upend everything she believed about her future. Morning came grey and damp, the rain having gentled to a fine mist that clung to the windows and beaded on the overgrown hedges, and Mrs. Beckett entered with her usual brisk efficiency, setting down a tray of tea and toast before pausing to study Eleanor's face with the knowing eyes of a woman who had served this family for 20 years and could read its daughter like a well-worn book. "You did not sleep," Beckett said, and it was not a question. Eleanor told her then, the words spilling out in a rush she could not contain, and Beckett listened without interruption, her weathered hands folded over her apron, her expression giving nothing away, until Eleanor had finished and sat breathless, waiting for judgment. "A man's true nature shows in how he treats those who can do nothing for him, my lady," Beckett said at last, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Watch how he speaks to the servants." Eleanor rose and dressed and walked out into the garden, her slippers dampening in the wet grass as she followed the familiar paths past the roses gone wild and the fountain choked with leaves, until she came to the corner where her mother's camellias had once bloomed in clouds of white, their waxy petals catching the light like captured moonbeams. The plants had died the winter after her mother, as if they could not bear to remain in a world she had left, and Eleanor knelt now in the bare earth where they had grown, pressing her fingers into the cold soil, as if she might find some trace of them there, some echo of the woman who had loved them. Her mother had married for love. Her parents had been happy, genuinely happy, in a way that had seemed to Eleanor as natural and inevitable as sunrise, until the Hartwell ball had taught her that such happiness was not her birthright, but a rare gift, bestowed on the fortunate and denied to those who dared to hope for it. She would not hope. She would not allow herself to hope. Hope was the cruelest trap of all, and she had learned that lesson at too high a cost to forget it. She would accept the Duke's proposal because it was practical, because it would save her father, because she had no better options and precious few worse ones. She would expect nothing but the terms he had outlined: his name, his protection, his fortune applied to her family's debts. She would not dream of more. She rose, brushing the dirt from her fingers, and walked back toward the house to write her acceptance. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel as they passed through the great iron gates of Thornwood Park, and Eleanor pressed her right thumb against the inside of her left wrist, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath the thin skin, as if it might somehow anchor her to this moment that seemed both impossibly real and utterly dreamlike. For the estate that unfolded before her was nothing like she had imagined during those sleepless nights at Briarwood, nothing like the cold and forbidding fortress her fears had constructed from whispered rumours and half-remembered glimpses of its master. The house rose from the landscape like something that had grown there rather than been built, its honey-coloured stone warm even beneath the pale spring sky, its windows catching the light and throwing it back in welcome rather than warning, and the grounds surrounding it were immaculate without being severe. Ancient oaks standing sentinel along the drive while carefully tended gardens softened the approach with early blooms in shades of cream and palest pink. Her father sat beside her, his hand finding hers and squeezing once, and she drew strength from that touch even as she steeled herself for what awaited within those graceful walls, for the man who had written such a businesslike proposal and who now expected her to become his Duchess in exchange for her family's salvation. They were shown into a formal study by a butler whose manner was correct but not cold, who addressed them with quiet respect and offered refreshment, and Eleanor noted these small details as Mrs. Beckett had advised, filing them away as evidence of how this household was run, of what manner of master commanded it. She was standing before a tall window that overlooked a rose garden when she heard his footsteps, measured and deliberate, and she turned to face Frederick Thornton, Duke of Ashford, as he entered his study and became real to her at last. He was taller than she remembered, broad-shouldered, in a way that spoke of physical activity rather than mere tailoring, and his dark hair was cut shorter than fashion dictated, silver threading at his temples despite his relative youth, in a way that might have seemed distinguished on another man, but on him seemed almost like a mark of something survived. His eyes met hers, and she felt the impact of that gaze like a physical thing, for they were green, the deep green of forest shadows, and they revealed nothing, nothing at all, as they moved over her face with an assessment that was thorough and entirely unreadable. He smelled of sandalwood and cedar with an undertone of leather, a scent she would later learn came from his shaving soap and hours spent in the saddle, and she breathed it in without meaning to as he crossed to greet her father first, his handshake firm, his words of welcome correct if not warm. The meeting proceeded with the formality of a business negotiation, which Eleanor supposed it was, and she listened as he outlined the terms in that clipped, precise voice that used words like currency to be spent sparingly. Her father's debts cleared in their entirety, a generous personal allowance for her use, full authority over the household and its management, a position of respect and security that would last the remainder of her days. He spoke of requiring a hostess, a partner in the management of his estates, someone of intelligence and dignity who could navigate the demands of his position, and he did not speak of affection, did not speak of companionship beyond the practical, did not speak of anything that might have suggested this was more than an arrangement of mutual convenience. When he asked if she had questions, Eleanor surprised herself by speaking before she could think better of it, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Why me, your grace? You could have any woman in England." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle flexing near his ear, and for a moment she thought she had offended him beyond repair. But when he spoke his voice was, if anything, slightly less guarded than before. "I have observed your character over the years, Miss Ashworth. I witnessed your conduct at the Hartwell ball, and in the seasons that followed. I saw a woman who endured public humiliation with dignity, who did not retreat into bitterness or cruelty, who carried herself with quiet grace when lesser souls would have crumbled." He paused, and something flickered in those green depths, something she could not name. "I have no interest in a wife who wants me for my title or my fortune. I want a practical partnership with a woman of substance. I believe you are that woman." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle over her, felt the strange comfort of being seen, truly seen, even if what he saw was only her usefulness. "I will not pretend to offer you love, madam," he continued, and his voice dropped lower, rougher, as if the words cost him something to speak. "That is not within my capacity, but I offer you my name, my protection, and my word that you will never again be made to feel small. I do not break my word." She thought of Clarence Pemberton, of his honeyed promises and laughing betrayal, of all the pretty words that had meant nothing, and she found in this man's stark honesty something she had not expected: relief. Her thumb pressed hard against her wrist as she spoke. "Then I accept, your grace." The chapel at Thornwood Park was ancient and beautiful, its stone walls softened by centuries of candlelight and prayer, and Eleanor stood at its threshold on the morning of her wedding with her father's arm trembling beneath her fingers, and a spring thunderstorm breaking against the stained glass windows, as if the heavens themselves wished to mark this moment with drama she had not requested and did not want. She wore her mother's pearls, the only treasure that had not been sold to pay debts, and they lay cool against her throat like a benediction from a woman 12 years dead, a woman who had married for love and been loved in return, and who would perhaps have wept to see her daughter walking toward a man who had promised protection but not affection, security but not tenderness, a future but not the kind Eleanor had once dreamed of in the innocent days before Clarence Pemberton had taught her what dreams were worth. The vicar's words rose and fell like music beneath the percussion of thunder, and Frederick stood before the altar in dark formal attire that made him seem even taller, even more imposing, his green eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity she could not read as she approached on feet that felt curiously distant from her body, as if she were watching herself from somewhere far away, a ghost attending her own transformation from Miss Ashworth to the Duchess of Ashford. His responses were clear and firm when he spoke his vows, his voice carrying easily over the storm's fury, and when he took her hand to place the ring upon her finger, his touch was steady, his skin warm against her cold fingers, and she noticed that he held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary, his thumb brushing once across her knuckles before he released her, a gesture so small she might have imagined it, were it not for the way his jaw tightened afterward, that telltale muscle flexing near his ear, as if the touch had cost him something he had not intended to spend. She breathed in and caught his scent, sandalwood and cedar and leather, and something in her chest loosened unexpectedly, some knot of fear she had not known she carried, because whatever else this man might be, he smelled of warmth and earth and living things, not of the hothouse flowers and champagne that still haunted her memories of humiliation. The wedding breakfast was small and quiet, held in a dining room where rain streamed down tall windows, and candles flickered against the grey afternoon light. And Eleanor met her new mother-in-law properly for the first time, when Lady Henrietta Thornton crossed the room to take both her hands and squeeze them with surprising strength, her eyes, green like her son's, but warmer, softer, crinkling at the corners as she smiled. "I am glad," the Dowager Duchess said quietly, pitched for Eleanor's ears alone, "that he has finally chosen well." Eleanor did not know what to make of those words, did not know what choosing well meant when the choice had been made for practical reasons by a man who claimed love was beyond his capacity, but she tucked them away to examine later, another piece of the puzzle that was Frederick Thornton. Her father embraced her before retiring to his guest chamber, his eyes bright with tears he would not shed, and whispered against her hair that he was proud of her, that her mother would have been proud, that she was the best thing he had ever done in a life full of failures. And Eleanor held him tightly and did not let herself weep, because weeping would suggest grief, and she was not grieving. She was simply beginning something new, something unknown, something that required all the dignity she possessed. That evening, with the storm still muttering against the windows, and the house grown quiet around her, Eleanor found herself alone in the vast library, drawn there by the promise of books and solitude, and a few moments to breathe without being watched. And she was running her fingers along the spines of a collection of Shakespeare's works, when she heard footsteps, and turned to find Frederick standing in the doorway, his cravat loosened, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, looking almost uncertain for the first time since she had met him. "You found the library," he said, and she thought she detected approval in his clipped tone. "I hoped you would." They spoke then, carefully, tentatively, of books and preferences, and Eleanor admitted her love of Shakespeare's sonnets, particularly the ones about love that endured, and she quoted without thinking, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments," and something flickered in his green eyes, something she could not name, before he admitted that he preferred the histories, the tales of kings and battles and power, though he did not disdain poetry entirely. The conversation was nothing remarkable, nothing that would set hearts racing or inspire great verse, but something eased between them in that candle-lit room, some wall lowered by a fraction, and when he finally bade her good night, he paused at the door and said quietly, "You did well today. Thank you." It was not romance, but as Eleanor stood alone in the library listening to his footsteps fade and the storm finally gentling to rain, she thought that perhaps it was something, a foundation upon which other things might someday be built, and she pressed her thumb to her wrist and felt her pulse beating steady and strong beneath skin that still remembered the warmth of his hand. The first fortnight of her marriage passed in a curious suspension between the life Eleanor had known and the life she was still learning to inhabit, and she moved through the great rooms of Thornwood Park with the careful attention of a scholar studying a text in an unfamiliar language, watching, always watching, for the clues that would tell her what manner of man she had married, and what manner of existence awaited her within these graceful walls. She remembered Mrs. Beckett's advice, as she observed Frederick with the household staff, noted how he addressed the butler by name, and inquired after the footman whose mother had taken ill with a fever, how he paused in the corridor to speak with a housemaid who had dropped a vase and stood trembling in anticipation of his wrath, only to hear him say, in that clipped but not unkind voice, that accidents happened, and she should fetch someone to help with the broken pieces before she cut herself. The housekeeper, a formidable woman named Mrs. Hartley, who had served the family for 30 years, confided to Eleanor, over a discussion of menus, that his Grace had personally approved funds for the head gardener's daughter to attend a school for young ladies in the village, a kindness he had forbidden anyone to mention to the girl's father, lest the man's pride be wounded. Eleanor filed these observations away like precious documents, evidence accumulating toward a verdict she was not yet ready to render, and she found herself looking for Frederick in rooms where she had no reason to expect him, listening for his footsteps in corridors, noting the particular quality of silence that seemed to follow in his wake. Lady Henrietta became her guide through these early days, taking tea with her each afternoon in the sunny morning room where generations of Thornton women had no doubt sat before them. And it was during one such afternoon that the Dowager Duchess began to speak of the son Eleanor was still struggling to understand. "He was not always this way," Lady Henrietta said, her green eyes, so like her son's, but softened by age and warmth, growing distant with memory. "As a boy he was lively, quick to laugh, forever bringing home injured creatures he had found in the woods and insisting they be nursed back to health. He felt everything so deeply, my Frederick. Too deeply, perhaps." She did not speak of Catherine directly, but the shadow of that name hung between them, and Eleanor understood without being told that something had broken in Frederick Thornton 5 years ago, something that had transformed a warm and feeling man into the controlled, guarded figure she had married. "My son has been a ghost these 5 years, Eleanor," Lady Henrietta said quietly, reaching across to take her hand with surprising strength. "You are the first thing that has made him seem alive." Eleanor carried those words with her as she explored the house in the days that followed, learning its rhythms and secrets, and it was during one such exploration that she found herself in the portrait gallery, a long room lined with generations of Thorntons, gazing down from gilt frames with eyes that seemed to follow her progress. She was studying a painting of a young woman in the fashion of the previous century, wondering if this might be the grandmother whose jewelry Frederick had not yet mentioned, when her foot caught on a loose edge of carpet and she stumbled forward with a sharp intake of breath. Strong hands caught her elbow before she could fall, steadying her with a grip that was firm but careful, and she looked up to find Frederick standing close, so close she could smell sandalwood and cedar and leather, so close she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. His hand was warm through the thin fabric of her sleeve, large and capable, and he held her a moment longer than necessary, his fingers pressing gently against her arm as if assuring himself she was steady. And something passed between them in that suspended instant, something Eleanor could not name, but felt like heat spreading from the point of contact through her entire body. Then his jaw tightened, that telltale muscle flexing near his ear, and he released her abruptly, stepping back as if burned. "You should have that seen to," he said, his voice clipped, nodding toward the offending carpet, and he turned and left without another word, his footsteps echoing in the gallery long after he had disappeared from view. Eleanor stood alone among the portraits of his ancestors, her skin still warm where he had touched her, and pressed her thumb against the inside of her wrist as if to steady a pulse that had suddenly, inexplicably, begun to race. The third week of her marriage settled into a rhythm that Eleanor found herself anticipating with a pleasure she did not examine too closely, for examination would require acknowledgment, and acknowledgment would lead to hope, and hope was a door she had nailed shut 3 years ago in a ballroom that still haunted her dreams. Her mornings began with correspondence in the morning room, Lady Henrietta guiding her through the intricacies of ducal obligations, with a patience that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere duty, and her afternoons were given to walks through the grounds, or rides on the pretty chestnut mare that Frederick had presented to her without comment, as if providing his wife with a horse worth more than her father's entire stable were a matter of no consequence. But it was the evenings she treasured most, though she would not have admitted it even under torture, those quiet hours in the library where Frederick sometimes joined her, and they spoke of estate business, or books, or nothing of particular importance, conversations that meant nothing, and yet somehow meant everything, for she found herself listening for his footsteps in the corridor and feeling something loosen in her chest when he appeared in the doorway, his dark hair slightly dishevelled from a day of riding, his green eyes finding hers across the room with an expression she could not read. It was on a morning in that third week that Eleanor walked to the stables to request her mare be saddled for an afternoon ride, the summer sun warm on her shoulders, and the scent of hay and horses and warm earth rising to meet her as she approached the weathered stone building, and she was about to call for a groom when she heard a voice, low and gentle, coming from one of the stalls at the far end. She followed the sound without thinking, her slippers silent on the packed earth floor, and what she found stopped her breath in her throat. Frederick knelt in the straw of an empty stall, his coat discarded, his shirt-sleeves rolled to the elbow, and in his large, capable hands he cradled a small grey cat with a white-tipped tail, its paw wrapped in what appeared to be a makeshift bandage torn from his own handkerchief. "There now, you foolish creature," he was saying, his voice so tender, so utterly unlike the clipped formality she had come to expect, that Eleanor felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes. "Hold still. I cannot help you if you insist on struggling." The cat mewed plaintively, and Frederick made a sound that might have been a laugh, soft and warm, as he adjusted the bandage with infinite care. "Yes, I know it hurts. But you should not have been climbing where you had no business climbing, should you?" Eleanor must have made some sound, some small intake of breath, because his head came up sharply and his eyes met hers, and she watched the transformation happen in the space of a heartbeat, the tenderness draining from his face like water from a broken vessel, replaced by that familiar guarded blankness that she was beginning to hate. He rose, brushing straw from his trousers, and walked past her with only a nod, his jaw tight, that muscle flexing near his ear, and Eleanor stood alone in the stable with the grey cat, watching her from the straw, and her heart aching with something she refused to name. That evening she could not stop thinking about what she had witnessed, about those large hands that had caught her elbow in the portrait gallery, now cradling an injured animal with such exquisite gentleness, and when Lady Henrietta joined her for tea, she found herself asking carefully about Frederick's nature as a boy. The dowager's green eyes softened with memory and grief. "He was forever bringing home wounded things," she said quietly. "Birds with broken wings, rabbits caught in snares, once a fox kit whose mother had been killed by hunters. He could not bear to see anything suffer. He feels too deeply, my Frederick. That is why he has learned not to feel at all." She set down her teacup and regarded Eleanor with an expression that saw too much. "Society will try to diminish you, my dear. They will whisper that you married above yourself, that Frederick settled for convenience. Let them whisper. The day will come when they see the truth, that my son did not settle at all. He finally chose wisely." The fourth week of her marriage brought a morning so fine that Eleanor could not help but feel something lift in her chest when she drew back the curtains and saw the summer sun blazing across the grounds of Thornwood Park, gilding the distant trees and turning the dew-laden grass to scattered diamonds, and she was still standing at the window when a footman arrived with a message that His Grace wondered if Her Grace might care to ride out with him to inspect the tenant farms. A request so unexpected and yet so welcome that she found herself agreeing before she had fully considered what it meant to spend an entire afternoon in his company with no library walls to contain them and no servants to provide the comfortable buffer of duty. They set out after luncheon, Frederick on his great black stallion, and Eleanor on the pretty chestnut mare he had given her, and she noticed almost immediately how he adjusted his pace to match hers, how his horse seemed always to be positioned just so, blocking the occasional gust of wind that swept across the open fields, shielding her from the dust kicked up by passing farm carts. And she understood that this was simply how he was, protective without proclamation, attentive without acknowledgement. And she filed this observation away, with all the others she had been collecting like precious stones since the day she had watched him kneel in stable straw with an injured cat cradled in his capable hands. They spoke little as they rode, but the silence between them had lost its awkward edges, had become something almost comfortable, and Eleanor found herself stealing glances at his profile, at the strong line of his jaw and the silver threading through his dark hair, and the way his green eyes surveyed his lands with an expression that spoke of duty and love, intertwined so deeply they could not be separated. The trouble began at the stream, a shallow ribbon of water that cut across the path between two tenant farms, barely deep enough to wet a horse's fetlocks, and Eleanor's mare, who had proven herself a sweet and biddable creature in every other circumstance, planted her hooves at the water's edge and refused absolutely to take another step forward. Frederick crossed easily, his stallion splashing through without hesitation, and turned to watch as Eleanor applied her heels and clicked her tongue and did everything a competent horsewoman ought to do, all to no avail whatsoever. "Come now," she said, her voice firm, but her patience beginning to fray at the edges. "It is only water, you ridiculous animal. You have crossed streams before. I have seen you do it." The mare flicked her ears back and did not move. "Please," Eleanor tried, abandoning dignity for negotiation. "Please, you beautiful, impossible beast, just a few steps. That is all I ask. Just walk forward like a sensible horse." Nothing. She leaned forward and stroked the mare's neck, her voice dropping to a coaxing murmur. "Sweetest angel, darling horror, I will bring you apples, I will bring you sugar, I will sing you lullabies, if that is what you require. Only please, for the love of all that is holy, cross this stream." And then she heard it, a sound so unexpected that for a moment she could not identify its source. A laugh, a real laugh, warm and surprised and utterly unguarded. And she looked up to find Frederick watching her from the opposite bank, his stern face transformed by genuine amusement, the corners of his eyes creased, his mouth curved in a smile that stole 10 years from his countenance and made her heart stutter in her chest. He looked young, she thought with sudden wonder. He looked alive. And she stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. This man who had been a ghost, and was now, in this moment, so vividly present that she could not look away. He rode back across the stream to her side, took her mare's bridle in one gloved hand, and led them both through the water, while Eleanor sat speechless in her saddle. "Angel and horror in the same breath," he said, the corner of his mouth still curved with the ghost of that extraordinary smile. "You have a gift for contradiction." They rode on together to the hilltop he had promised to show her, the highest point on the estate, and when they crested the rise, Eleanor drew in her breath at the view spread before them, the whole of Thornwood Park laid out like a tapestry in shades of green and gold, the great house in the distance, the farms and fields and forests that comprised his domain, and were now, she realized with a start, hers as well. "This is my favorite place," Frederick said quietly, his eyes on the horizon rather than on her. "I have never brought anyone here." The significance of those words settled over her like a mantle, heavy with meaning she was not yet ready to examine, and she sat beside him in the warm summer sun, with the smell of grass and earth and horses surrounding them, and she felt something crack in the wall she had built around her heart. A fissure, small but irreparable, and she knew with terrifying certainty that she was in danger of feeling far more than was wise for this complicated, guarded, unexpectedly tender man who had married her for convenience and was showing her, piece by piece, the hidden country of his soul. The 5th week of her marriage brought with it a contentment Eleanor had not anticipated and did not entirely trust, for contentment was a close cousin to hope, and hope remained a door she had sworn never to open again. Yet she found herself waking each morning with something perilously close to eagerness, her grey eyes seeking the window to gauge the weather, and her mind already turning to the day ahead, to the correspondence she would review with Lady Henrietta, to the afternoon walk she might take through the gardens, to the evening hours in the library where Frederick might join her, and they might speak of nothing consequential, while something unspoken hummed beneath every word. Mrs. Beckett noticed the change, as Mrs. Beckett noticed everything. And one morning, while arranging Eleanor's chestnut hair into its elegant chignon, she remarked with studied casualness that the household staff had grown quite fond of the new Duchess, that cook had been heard praising her Grace's thoughtful inquiries about the kitchen gardens, and that his Grace himself had been observed in conversation with the housekeeper, asking pointed questions about her Grace's preferences in food, in flowers, in everything. "He asked specifically about flowers, my lady," Beckett said, her eyes meeting Eleanor's in the mirror with an expression that saw far too much. "Wanted to know if you had mentioned any particular favourites." Eleanor's heart stuttered at this intelligence, but she kept her voice steady as she replied that she could not imagine why the Duke would concern himself with such trivial matters, and Beckett merely hummed in that knowing way of hers and said nothing further, though her silence spoke volumes. 3 days later, a delivery arrived that drove all pretense of indifference from Eleanor's mind. A crate from a London bookseller, heavy and promising, which a footman carried to her private sitting-room, at his Grace's instruction. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers to find a complete set of Shakespeare's works, 20 volumes bound in the most beautiful green leather she had ever seen, the spines tooled in gold, the pages edged in gilt that caught the summer light streaming through the windows. There was no note, no card, nothing to indicate the sender. But Eleanor knew. She knew with a certainty that made her press her thumb hard against the inside of her wrist to steady the sudden racing of her pulse. That evening at dinner, she thanked him, her voice carefully controlled, and Frederick merely nodded, his expression giving nothing away. But his green eyes warmed to jade as he said, "You mentioned the sonnets. I noticed you had only a worn single volume." Such a simple statement, such an ordinary observation, and yet Eleanor heard what lay beneath it. I was listening, I remembered. I cared enough to act. She could not speak past the tightness in her throat, and he did not seem to expect a response, returning his attention to his meal, as if he had not just shaken the foundations of everything she believed about this marriage. 3 days after the books arrived, Eleanor was walking in the garden when she heard unfamiliar voices near the south wall, and she followed the sound to find a weathered man in a nurseryman's apron, directing 2 assistants in the planting of small shrubs, their glossy dark leaves and waxy white buds unmistakable even from a distance. White camellias. Eleanor stopped walking, stopped breathing, her hand rising to press against her chest, where her heart had begun to pound with painful intensity. She had mentioned them once, only once, In passing, weeks ago, a brief comment about her mother's garden and the flowers that had died when she had, and she had not thought he was listening, had not imagined he would remember, had certainly never dreamed he would send to a renowned nursery for plants to fill the empty space where her mother's camellias had once grown. She stood frozen as the gardeners worked, as the white blooms nodded in the summer breeze, as the scent of them reached her and brought with it a flood of memory so powerful she had to close her eyes against it. Her mother's hands, gentle and sure, teaching her to tend the delicate plants. Her mother's voice, warm with love, explaining that camellias meant devotion, meant longing, meant my heart is yours. That evening she found Frederick in the library, standing before the fire with a book in his hands, and he looked up when she entered with an expression she could not read. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt wholly inadequate, her voice rough with the tears she would not let fall. "For the camellias. I did not think you were listening." He set down his book and regarded her with those forest-dark eyes, and something passed between them, something that made the air feel thick and charged, and when he spoke his voice was low and quiet in the firelit room. "You are welcome," he said. "I listen, Eleanor, even when it seems I do not." The 6th week of her marriage brought a summer storm so violent that the windows of Thornwood Park rattled in their frames, and the ancient oaks on the south lawn bent like supplicants before an angry god, and Eleanor found herself trapped in the library with Frederick as the evening drew in, and the thunder rolled across the sky in great crashing waves that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. She had been reading, or attempting to read, one of the green leather volumes of Shakespeare he had given her, but the words blurred before her eyes as she became increasingly aware of Frederick's stillness in the chair across from hers, the way his hands gripped the armrests with a tension that whitened his knuckles, the rigid set of his shoulders beneath his dark coat as if he were bracing himself against something far more threatening than mere weather. The fire crackled in the grate, sending shadows dancing across the book-lined walls, and the scent of sandalwood and cedar reached her as it always did when he was near. That scent she had come to associate with safety, with home, with him. But tonight there was something else in the air, something heavy and fraught, that made her set aside her book and watch him with growing concern as lightning split the sky beyond the windows and illuminated his face in harsh white light. He was staring into the flames, his green eyes distant, lost somewhere she could not follow, and the muscle near his jaw worked steadily as thunder crashed overhead with a violence that made her flinch. "Frederick," she said softly, and he did not respond, did not seem to hear her at all, and she understood then that wherever he had gone in his mind, it was a place of profound darkness. She waited, her heart aching with a tenderness she could no longer deny, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scraped raw by something that had nothing to do with the storm outside, and everything to do with the storm within. "It was a night like this," he said, still not looking at her, his hands still gripping the armrests, as if they were the only things anchoring him to the present. "When Catherine—" He stopped, swallowed, and Eleanor saw his hands tremble, those large, capable hands that had been so gentle with an injured cat, so careful when he clasped the bracelet around her wrist. "I was in London. Parliamentary business. I should have been here." The words came slowly, painfully, dragged from some deep place he had kept locked for 5 long years. "She went into labor early. The message reached me too late. I rode through the night, through a storm much like this one, and when I arrived—" His voice broke, and Eleanor's eyes burned with tears she would not let fall. "They were already buried. My wife, my son. I never saw them. I never said goodbye." The thunder rolled again, and Frederick's jaw tightened, the muscle flexing as he fought for control. "I was not there. I should have been there. If I had been there, perhaps—" He could not finish, and Eleanor could bear the distance between them no longer. She rose from her chair and crossed to kneel beside his, close enough to catch his scent, close enough to see the devastation in his green eyes when he finally turned to look at her. But she did not touch him, sensing that he balanced on a knife's edge, and the wrong gesture might shatter him entirely. "It was not your fault," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "You could not have known. You could not have changed what happened." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and his eyes were the colour of winter pine, cold with old grief, and something that might have been fear. "I made myself a promise," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Never again. Never to care that deeply again. It is safer." And Eleanor understood, with a clarity that stole her breath, exactly what she was facing, exactly what walls he had built around his wounded heart. And she understood, too, with terrifying certainty, that she had already begun to care for this complicated, guarded, broken man far more than was safe, far more than was wise, far more than she had ever intended when she had promised herself she would not hope. The journey to London took 2 days, and Eleanor spent most of it with her right thumb pressed against the inside of her left wrist, feeling her pulse flutter beneath the thin skin like a caged bird desperate for escape, for this would be her first public appearance since the Hartwell ball 3 years ago, her first time facing the society that had witnessed her humiliation and whispered about it ever since. And though she was now the Duchess of Ashford, though she wore the camellia bracelet warm against her wrist, and carried with her the memory of Frederick's trembling hands in the firelit library, she could not shake the cold dread that settled in her stomach as the townhouse came into view, a grand edifice of pale stone that seemed to watch her approach with the same calculating assessment she expected from every pair of eyes at the Kensington ball. Frederick, seated across from her in the carriage, must have sensed her mounting anxiety, for he leaned forward and said in that quiet, clipped way of his, "You are the Duchess of Ashford. You answer to no one." And the words, so simple and so certain, steadied something inside her, even as her heart continued its frantic rhythm. Lady Henrietta had travelled separately, but arrived within the hour, sweeping into the townhouse drawing-room with the air of a general preparing for battle, her sharp eyes taking in Eleanor's pale face and offering a small, knowing smile that promised solidarity. The night of the ball arrived with the cruel swiftness of all dreaded things, and Eleanor stood before her mirror in a gown of deep green silk that Mrs. Beckett had insisted upon, the colour rich and dark as forest shadows, as a certain pair of eyes that had begun to haunt her dreams. And when Frederick appeared at her chamber door to escort her downstairs, she saw something flicker in his expression, something warm and almost wondering that made her breath catch, before his face resumed its usual stern composure. The Kensington ball was everything she remembered society events to be, and everything she had hoped never to endure again. The blaze of 1,000 candles, the crush of bodies in silks and satins, the symphony of music and laughter, and beneath it all the constant, sibilant hiss of whispers that seemed to follow her like a shadow as she entered on Frederick's arm. She held her head high, her spine straight, drawing on every lesson her mother had ever taught her about dignity and grace. And Frederick stayed close, so close she could catch the scent of sandalwood and cedar that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, his presence a bulwark against the curious stares and pointed glances. They danced, and Eleanor discovered that Frederick waltzed as he did everything else, with controlled power and surprising grace, his hand warm and steady at her waist, his green eyes never leaving her face. And for a few breathless moments she forgot the watching crowd, forgot the whispers, forgot everything but the strength of his arm and the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against her back. The music ended, and reality returned with brutal swiftness, in the form of a golden-haired figure approaching through the crowd, Lady Arabella Pemberton on his arm like a beautiful brittle ornament, and Eleanor felt the old wound tear open as Lord Clarence Pemberton stopped before them with a smile that did not reach his pale blue eyes. "Your Grace," he said to Frederick, with a bow that bordered on mockery, then turned that calculating gaze upon Eleanor with an expression of exaggerated surprise. "And the former Miss Ashworth, now so remarkably elevated. I confess myself astonished that Ashford was so desperate as to look so far beneath his station for a bride." The words struck like blows, designed to wound, designed to remind her of exactly what she had been and what he had deemed her worth. And Eleanor felt herself freeze, felt the old humiliation rise like bile in her throat, her thumb pressing hard against her wrist as 3 years of carefully buried pain threatened to overwhelm her. But before she could speak, before she could flee, Frederick stepped forward, positioning himself between her and Clarence, and his green eyes had gone cold as winter pine. Frederick's response to Clarence was devastating in its quiet control, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby listeners to hear without ever rising above the measured tone of a man who had no need to shout when his very presence commanded attention. And Eleanor watched as the muscle in his jaw tightened, that familiar tell she had come to know so well in the weeks of their marriage, the sign that he was suppressing something fierce beneath his composed exterior. "I would choose my words with great care, Pemberton," he said. And though his voice remained low, there was something in it that made Clarence's pale blue eyes flicker with the first hint of uncertainty. "You speak of desperation, yet I recall hearing that your own marriage was motivated by rather mercenary considerations, and how fortunate that worked out so well for you." His gaze flicked to Arabella, whose brittle beauty seemed to crack further beneath the implication, her sharp smile faltering as the surrounding guests fell into a silence that spoke louder than any whisper, for everyone knew the truth of the Pemberton marriage, the empty fortune locked in trusts, the wife who took lovers openly, the husband who had traded love for gold and received nothing but misery in return. Frederick's hand moved then to rest at the small of Eleanor's back, warm and steady through the deep green silk of her gown, a gesture of possession and protection that sent heat spreading through her, even as her heart pounded against her ribs, and she felt the weight of every watching eye, the collective intake of breath from the gathered society that had once witnessed her humiliation and now witnessed something else entirely. "My wife," Frederick continued, and the way he said the word made it sound like a declaration of war and a vow of devotion all at once, "is the finest woman in this room. And I did not settle, Pemberton. I chose. And I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." The words fell into the silence with the weight of absolute conviction, and Eleanor could not breathe, could not think, could only stand there with his hand burning through her gown and his green eyes cold as winter pine as they held Clarence's gaze until the other man looked away, pale and diminished, while Arabella's face twisted with something that might have been envy, or might have been the bitter recognition of everything she had lost in choosing wealth over worth. Frederick guided Eleanor away then, his hand never leaving her back as he steered her through the parting crowd toward a private terrace where the cool night air rushed over her heated skin and she could finally draw breath, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of what had just occurred. "You did not need to," she began, but he interrupted her, his voice rough in a way she had only heard once before, in a fire-lit library during a storm, when he had spoken of graves and grief and the terrible cost of caring. "Yes," he said, turning to face her in the moonlight, his green eyes fierce and burning with something she was afraid to name. "I did, Eleanor. I made you a vow. I told you that you would never again be made to feel small, and I meant it. I meant every word." The sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such intensity, such fierce protectiveness, shattered something inside her, some final wall she had built around her wounded heart, and Eleanor realized with stunning, terrifying clarity that she was in love with him. Desperately, and completely in love with this complicated, guarded man who showed his heart through actions rather than words, who had defended her honor before all of society, who looked at her now as though she were something precious and irreplaceable, and the thought filled her with equal measures of joy and terror, for she knew too well the danger of hope, and yet she could no longer deny that hope had taken root in her heart, despite every promise she had made to keep it out. Eleanor woke to the pale grey light of a London morning filtering through unfamiliar curtains, her body heavy with exhaustion, though she had lain in bed for hours, her mind refusing the mercy of sleep as it replayed the events of the Kensington ball in an endless, dizzying loop. Clarence's cruel smile, the whispers that had followed her like shadows, and then Frederick's voice cutting through it all with that devastating quiet conviction, his hand warm and steady at the small of her back, his green eyes fierce as winter pine as he declared her the finest woman in the room, and she pressed her right thumb against the inside of her left wrist, now as she had done so many times before, feeling her pulse flutter beneath the thin skin. But this time the rapid rhythm was not born of fear or humiliation, but of something far more dangerous, something she had sworn never to feel again. Mrs. Beckett entered with a tray bearing chocolate and toast, her weathered face creased with barely suppressed satisfaction as she set it upon the bedside table and began arranging Eleanor's silk wrapper at the foot of the bed. "The household is all abuzz this morning, my lady," Beckett said, and there was a gleam in her eye that Eleanor had not seen since before the Hartwell ball 3 years ago. "They say his Grace defended you before all of society, that Lord Pemberton looked ready to faint dead away, and that the Duke appeared quite prepared to call him out if he spoke another word against you." Eleanor took the chocolate with trembling hands, the rich scent rising to meet her as she sipped, and she could not help the warmth that spread through her chest at Beckett's words, even as terror coiled alongside it like a serpent in tall grass. She had promised herself she would not hope, had built walls around her wounded heart with the careful precision of a mason constructing a fortress, and yet Frederick's words on the terrace echoed through her memory with relentless persistence. "I made you a vow. I told you that you would never again be made to feel small. I meant it." She recalled his confession in the library during the summer storm, his trembling hands and devastated eyes as he spoke of Catherine and the son he had never held, of the promise he had made himself never to care that deeply again, because caring led only to unbearable loss. And she understood with aching clarity that they were both prisoners of the same fear, both building walls against the very thing they most desperately wanted, and yet she could not stop herself from wanting more, wanting everything, wanting him in ways that terrified her precisely because she knew how completely he could destroy her if she let him. Lady Henrietta arrived shortly after noon, sweeping into Eleanor's private sitting room with her sharp eyes taking in everything, the shadows beneath Eleanor's grey eyes, the way her hands twisted in her lap, the camellia bracelet glinting at her wrist. "You care for him," the Dowager Duchess said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Eleanor, with the air of a woman who had seen too much of life to waste time on pleasantries. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact, as immutable as the turning of the seasons. Eleanor opened her mouth to deny it, to offer some measured, careful response that would protect the fragile walls she had built, but the words would not come, and instead she heard herself say in a voice barely above a whisper, "I did not intend to." Lady Henrietta's expression softened with something that looked almost like hope. "No one ever does, my dear. That is precisely what makes it love rather than mere calculation. The question is not whether you care for him, but what you intend to do about it." She leaned forward, her aged hands reaching to clasp Eleanor's trembling fingers. "My son has been a ghost these 5 years, Eleanor. I have watched him move through the world as though he were already buried alongside Catherine and the child. But since your marriage, he has been different, lighter, more present, more alive than I have seen him, since before the tragedy, and he may not know how to say it. He may not yet have the words for what he feels, but he shows it in everything he does. Watch what he does, not what he cannot yet speak. The weeks that followed the Kensington ball passed in a blur of candle-lit ballrooms and crowded drawing-rooms, of musicales where Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and her heart racing each time Frederick leaned close to murmur some observation about the performance, his breath warm against her ear, and his scent of sandalwood and cedar wrapping around her like a promise she was still too afraid to believe. And she found herself watching him with new eyes now, cataloguing every gesture, every glance, every small act of care that Lady Henrietta had urged her to notice. And what she saw left her breathless, with a hope she could no longer suppress, no matter how fiercely she tried. At a reception hosted by Lady Cromwell, the crush of guests pressed them together in the overcrowded salon, and Frederick's hand found hers in the crowd without hesitation, his fingers threading through hers with a naturalness that made her pulse stutter. And when a portly gentleman jostled past them with too much enthusiasm, Frederick shifted his body to shield her, angling himself between Eleanor and the press of guests, as though protecting her were as instinctive as breathing. She noticed how he watched the room, his green eyes scanning for any sign of Clarence or Arabella, positioning them always where she would not be caught off guard, and when she grew tired at a particularly tedious dinner party hosted by Lord and Lady Hartwell, he noticed before she could speak a word, rising from his chair and making their excuses with such smooth authority that their hostess could only curtsy and wish them well. And in the carriage afterward he said nothing, merely drew her hand into his lap and held it there, his thumb tracing absent circles on her palm, while the London streets passed by in a blur of gaslight and shadow. At a crowded musicale 3 days later, Eleanor mentioned in passing that the heat and the perfume of too many bodies in too small a space had given her a headache, and within moments Frederick had guided her to a quiet corner near an open window, procuring a glass of cool lemonade and standing beside her like a sentinel. While the soprano's voice soared through arias Eleanor could barely hear over the pounding of her own heart. He did not speak of feelings, did not offer flowery declarations or poetic vows, but his actions spoke with a constancy that left her aching with want and wonder, and she remembered Lady Henrietta's words, "Watch what he does, not what he cannot yet speak." The morning rides in Hyde Park became her favourite hours. The crisp autumn air, sharp with the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke as they rode side by side along the sandy paths, their horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm, while Frederick spoke of his plans for Thornwood Park, of improvements to the tenant cottages, and a new school he wished to build for the village children. And when he asked her opinion, she gave it freely, surprised by how seriously he listened, how carefully he considered her suggestions. "You have good instincts," he said one morning, as they paused at the crest of a small rise overlooking the Serpentine, the water glinting silver in the pale autumn light. "I value your counsel." And the words, simple as they were, struck her with the force of a declaration, for she understood now that for a man who guarded his heart as fiercely as Frederick did, such an admission was no small thing, and her heart ached with wanting more, with wanting everything, with wanting him to say the words she could see sometimes flickering in his green eyes before he looked away. The journey back to Thornwood Park felt different than Eleanor had anticipated, the familiar countryside rolling past the carriage windows, no longer a landscape of exile, but something closer to homecoming, and she found herself pressing her face to the glass like a child as the great iron gates came into view, the gravel drive crunching beneath the wheels in a rhythm that seemed to welcome her rather than merely receive her. And when Frederick handed her down from the carriage, his fingers lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, his green eyes warming to jade as he said quietly, "Welcome home, madam." And the word home settled into her chest like a living thing, taking root in the spaces between her ribs where fear had once lodged. Like broken glass, the white camellias had flourished in her absence, their waxy petals gleaming in the pale autumn light as Eleanor walked the garden paths the following morning, and she knelt beside them, as she had once knelt beside the bare earth at Briarwood. But this time her fingers touched blooms rather than memory, life rather than loss, and she thought of her mother with a tenderness that no longer carried the sharp edge of grief, thought of Frederick, who had listened when she believed no one was listening, who had planted these flowers in soil he had never seen her touch, who had given her back something she had thought lost forever. She was no longer pretending she did not love him, could no longer maintain the careful fiction that her heart remained safely walled behind the fortress she had constructed after Clarence's betrayal, and the admission terrified her, even as it set something free in her chest, some caged bird that had been beating its wings against her ribs for months now, desperate for release. That evening found them in the library, as had become their custom, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the familiar scent of leather bindings and old paper wrapping around Eleanor like a blanket, and she settled into her usual chair with the green-bound Shakespeare Frederick had given her. But she could not focus on the sonnets, could not make sense of the familiar words, because she felt his gaze on her like a physical touch, warm and searching. And when she looked up, his green eyes were fixed on her face with an expression she could not quite name. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, and Frederick set down his own book with deliberate care, the muscle in his jaw working as it did when he struggled with words that would not come easily. "No," he said slowly, and his voice had dropped to that lower register that made her pulse quicken, rough with something suppressed. "Something is right. I am not accustomed to it." He rose then and crossed to the small table near the window where a velvet box sat that Eleanor had not noticed before, and when he returned to stand before her chair, she saw that his hands were not quite steady, those large, capable hands that had caught her in the portrait gallery, that had led her mare through the stream, that had rested at the small of her back while he declared her the finest woman in the room. "This was my grandmother's," he said, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold bracelet set with a single pearl, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat at its beauty, at the tiny camellia-shaped clasp that glinted in the firelight. "Not Catherine's," he added carefully, and the distinction mattered. She understood that it mattered profoundly. "My grandmother was married to my grandfather for 53 years. She told me once that love was not a feeling but a choice, made new every day." He knelt before her chair, and Eleanor could not breathe, could not move, could watch as he took her wrist in his gentle grip and clasped the bracelet around it, his fingers lingering on her pulse point where she had so often pressed her own thumb to steady herself. "I wanted you to have it," he said, and when he looked up at her, his green eyes held something vulnerable and fierce and utterly unguarded, and Eleanor could not speak past the tightness in her throat, could only look at him with her heart in her eyes, the camellia clasp cool against her skin, and the fire casting golden light across his face, and she understood that they stood together on the precipice of something neither of them had expected to find. The storm announced itself with a low rumble that seemed to rise from the very foundations of Thornwood Park, and Eleanor felt the sound move through her chest as she sat in her usual chair by the library fire, the camellia bracelet warm against her wrist, and her grey eyes fixed on Frederick, where he stood before the flames, with his back to her, his broad shoulders rigid beneath the fine wool of his coat, and his hands clasped behind him, in that posture she had come to recognize as the one he assumed when words failed him, when the feelings he had spent 5 years suppressing threatened to break through the walls he had so carefully constructed, and she could not speak, could not move, could only watch him and wait, while the thunder rolled closer and the lightning painted silver shadows across the library's tall windows. and the fire crackled and spat, as if it too sensed the magnitude of what trembled unspoken in the air between them. He turned to face her at last, and his green eyes were not cold, were not guarded, were instead raw with something that made her breath catch in her throat. And when he spoke, his voice was rough, halting, each word dragged from some deep place within him that he had kept locked away since the night he had ridden home to find Catherine and his son already in the ground. "I told you once," he said, and paused, and the muscle in his jaw flexed as it always did when he struggled against himself. "I told you once that love was not within my capacity, that I could offer you my name and my protection, but not my heart. And I believed it, Eleanor. I believed it because believing it was safer than admitting the truth." He crossed the room to her then, his movements no longer controlled but urgent, almost desperate. And he knelt before her chair, as she had once knelt beside his, and when he took her hands in his own, she felt the tremor in his fingers, those large, gentle hands that had caught her in the portrait gallery and clasped the bracelet around her wrist and touched the injured stable cat with such unexpected tenderness. "I was wrong," he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming almost rough with suppressed emotion. "I was a coward. I have been a coward since the moment I first saw you standing in my study with your chin raised and your grey eyes full of quiet defiance, telling me you would accept my proposal because you had no choice, but that you would rather die than marry a man who could not love you. And I thought, this woman, this extraordinary woman, she deserves so much more than I can give her, and I was terrified, Eleanor. I was terrified because I knew even then that you had already begun to matter to me in ways I had sworn never to allow." The storm broke fully now, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the glass in its frames, and Frederick lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing away the tears she had not realized were streaming down her cheeks, as he recited softly, his green eyes holding hers, "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." And she recognized the words from Sonnet 116, the very poem she had mentioned on their wedding night in this very library, and she understood that he had remembered, that he had always remembered, that he had been listening even when she thought he was not. "I have loved you, Eleanor," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "Since the moment you stood before me and refused to pretend, I have loved you, and I have been terrified of it, terrified of losing you as I lost Catherine, terrified of caring so deeply that your absence would destroy me. But I cannot pretend any longer. I cannot keep myself from you any longer, and if you will have me, if you can forgive me for being too much a coward to speak sooner, I will spend the rest of my life proving that you were right to hope, that love is not mere fantasy, that you deserve to be chosen, truly chosen, not for convenience or practicality, but because you are irreplaceable, because you are everything, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Eleanor reached for him then, her hands framing his face as his had framed hers, and she told him through her tears that she loved him too, that she had promised herself not to hope, but hope had never asked her permission. And when he kissed her at last, the storm raged on outside. But they were safe, they were home, they were finally and completely together. The storm still raged beyond the windows as Frederick lifted her from the chair where they had stood wrapped in each other's arms, and Eleanor found herself carried through the darkened corridors of Thornwood Park, with her face pressed against his neck, where the scent of sandalwood and cedar and leather surrounded her like a promise, his arms steady and sure beneath her, as if she weighed nothing at all, as if he had been waiting all his life to carry her exactly thus. And when they reached the master chambers, he set her down with such careful reverence that she felt tears prick her eyes again, felt the magnitude of this moment settle into her bones like the thunder that shook the ancient stones of the house around them. He was tender in ways she had not imagined possible from a man of such controlled reserve, his large hands gentle as they traced the architecture of her face, the curve of her shoulder, the delicate bones of her wrist where the camellia bracelet caught the firelight, and when he spoke her name it was with a roughness that undid her entirely, that stripped away the last vestiges of the walls she had built around her wounded heart 3 years ago, in a ballroom where a golden-haired man had laughed at her pain. The storm outside seemed to move through them both, fierce and unrelenting, and Eleanor discovered that Frederick's legendary control extended even to this, that he was patient and attentive and focused entirely upon her pleasure, as if nothing else in the world existed, as if she were the only thing that had ever mattered, and she understood at last what it meant to be chosen, truly chosen, not for fortune or convenience, but because someone had seen her and found her irreplaceable. Afterward they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of him, of them, and his hands would not stop moving over her skin, as if he needed constant reassurance that she was real, that she was here, that she was his, and when he spoke against her temple, his voice was rough with wonder and regret. "I wasted 3 months," he said. 3 months of being too afraid to tell you, too afraid to reach for what I wanted most." And Eleanor laughed, a sound of such pure, unguarded joy that it surprised them both, her hands becoming animated as they always did when she was truly happy, gesturing even in the warm darkness of their shared bed. "We have the rest of our lives," she said, and he pulled back to look at her with those green eyes soft as spring leaves, warm as jade, and something in his face made her heart clench with the force of her love for him. "Yes," he said simply, "we do." Morning came grey and gentle through the tall windows, the storm having spent itself some time in the small hours while they slept wrapped around each other, and Eleanor woke to find Frederick already watching her with a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth, his dark hair dishevelled against the pillows and silver threading at his temples, catching the pale light. "Good morning, wife," he said, and the word sounded different now, weighted with meaning it had not carried before, and Eleanor reached up to touch his face with wondering fingers, marvelling that she was allowed, that this stern and guarded man had opened himself to her so completely. "Good morning, husband," she replied, and the camellia bracelet glinted on her wrist as she traced the line of his jaw, and she thought of the promise she had made herself in the overgrown garden at Briarwood, kneeling in the dirt where her mother's flowers once grew. She had promised herself she would not hope. But hope, it seemed, had never asked her permission. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford returned to London for the winter season 1 month after that storm-swept night in the library, and Eleanor discovered that the city she had once dreaded now seemed to welcome her with open arms. Or perhaps it was simply that she no longer cared what welcome it offered, because she carried her home with her in the form of the man whose hand rested at the small of her back as they ascended the grand staircase of the Wellington estate, his touch warm and possessive and entirely unnecessary for her balance, but utterly essential for her happiness, and she could feel the weight of every gaze in the glittering ballroom turning toward them as they paused at the top of the stairs, could hear the whispers beginning to ripple through the crowd, like wind through summer wheat. But these whispers were different from the ones that had followed her 3 years ago, different even from the curious murmurs at the Kensington ball. For now, the Ton watched the cold Duke of Ashford look at his wife as though she hung the moon and stars, watched his stern face soften into something approaching tenderness whenever she spoke, watched his green eyes warm to jade each time she laughed, and Eleanor knew that Lady Henrietta's prediction was unfolding before all of society's eager eyes. She wore the camellia bracelet at her wrist and a gown of deep sapphire blue that Frederick had commissioned from the finest modiste in London without telling her, a gown that made her grey eyes shimmer like storm-touched silver, and her chestnut hair gleam with threads of copper in the candlelight. And when she had protested the extravagance, he had simply looked at her with that faint smile she had come to treasure, and said that a duchess ought to dress like one, though they both knew the truth was simpler and more profound. He wanted the world to see her as he saw her, and he had the means to ensure they did. The Wellington Ball was the grandest event of the winter season, the ballroom blazing with 1,000 candles and fragrant with hothouse flowers and alive with the music of a full orchestra. And Frederick led her through the crush of silk and diamonds, with his hand never leaving hers, his tall frame angled to shield her from jostling, his deep voice murmuring observations about their fellow guests that made her press her lips together to suppress laughter. And when he swept her onto the floor for the first waltz, he held her closer than propriety strictly permitted, his hand spanning her waist with familiar possession, his eyes never leaving her face. Lady Henrietta stood at the edge of the dance floor, with tears glittering in her sharp eyes, watching her son laugh at something his wife said, watching the ghost she had mourned for 5 years finally become flesh and blood again. And when Eleanor caught her gaze across the crowded room, the Dowager Duchess raised her champagne glass in a silent toast that needed no words. Lord Clarence Pemberton was present with Lady Arabella on his arm, and Eleanor saw them standing near the refreshment table in almost exactly the spot where Clarence had once stood to mock her. But there was no triumph in his pale blue eyes. Tonight, only a hollow envy that aged his handsome face beyond its years, and Arabella looked thin and brittle beside him, her beauty sharp-edged with disappointment, her gaze following the Duke and Duchess with something that might have been regret. Frederick noticed them too, and he made a point of dancing with Eleanor again and again, of fetching her champagne himself rather than sending a footman, of laughing openly at her dry observations about the more ridiculous fashions on display. And when Lord Harrison Wellington approached to comment on the Duke's obvious devotion to his bride, Frederick's response carried clearly across the nearby dancers. "I am the most fortunate man in England, Wellington, for I married the only woman who ever told me she would rather die than be my wife, and it seems she has changed her mind." Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm and approving, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, even as joy bloomed in her chest, and she watched Clarence turn away with his jaw tight and his soft hands clenched at his sides, and she thought of the girl she had been 3 years ago, fleeing this very world in tears, and she pressed her thumb against the inside of her wrist, not to steady herself, but simply to feel her own pulse beating strong and sure, the pulse of a woman who had been chosen, truly chosen, and who would never doubt her worth again. The years that followed the Wellington Ball unfolded like the pages of a story Eleanor had once believed too beautiful to be written for someone like her. And yet here she was, living it, breathing it, watching it bloom around her with each passing season, as Thornwood Park transformed from the grand house where she had arrived as a practical bride into the home where she had discovered that love was not the cruel illusion she had feared, but something far more remarkable, something that grew stronger. With each morning she woke in Frederick's arms, and each evening they spent together in the library, where he had first confessed his heart to her, while storms raged beyond the windows. 3 years after that winter season of their public triumph, Eleanor stood in the garden, where the white camellias now flourished in magnificent profusion, their waxy petals gleaming in the summer sunlight, and she watched her daughter toddle across the lawn toward Frederick, who knelt with his arms outstretched, and his stern face transformed by a smile that still had the power to steal her breath, and she pressed her hand against the swell of her belly, where their second child grew, and felt tears prick her eyes at the abundance of her joy. Little Catherine. Henrietta Thornton, named for the wife Frederick had lost, and the mother who had never stopped believing her son would find happiness again, had her father's dark hair and her mother's grey eyes, and she laughed as Frederick swept her up and settled her on his shoulders, his large hands gentle and sure, as they had always been with anything small and vulnerable. And Eleanor remembered the stable cat with the white-tipped tail who still prowled the grounds, and sometimes wound around Frederick's ankles when he thought no one was watching. Lady Henrietta had wept when they told her of the pregnancy, had wept again when the child was born healthy and strong, and now she spent long afternoons in the nursery telling her granddaughter stories of the father she adored, the father who had once been a ghost, but was now so vibrantly alive that Eleanor sometimes wondered how she had ever thought him cold. Her own father visited often, his health restored by the relief of debts paid and the joy of seeing his daughter so thoroughly cherished, and he would sit with Frederick in the library discussing books and philosophy, while Eleanor listened and marvelled at how naturally they had become family. Mrs. Beckett remained at her side, promoted now to head of the household staff, and she never tired of reminding Eleanor that she had always known His Grace was a good man, that she had seen it in the way he spoke to the servants from the very first day. The camellia bracelet still circled Eleanor's wrist, its pearl warm against her skin, and sometimes Frederick would lift her hand to his lips and press a kiss to the tiny camellia clasp, his green eyes soft with a tenderness he no longer tried to hide. They had weathered storms together, literal and otherwise, and Eleanor had learned that the love she had once dismissed as fantasy was not only real, but stronger than anything she had imagined. Not a fragile thing that shattered at the first sign of hardship, but a living force that deepened with each shared sunrise and whispered confidence and quiet evening by the fire. And so the story of Eleanor and Frederick Thornton, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, became one of those tales that society told and retold in drawing rooms and at dinner parties for years to come, not as a cautionary tale of ambition or a scandal to be whispered behind fans, but as something rarer and more precious, a true love story, the kind that reminded even the most cynical observers that sometimes, against all odds and expectations, two wounded hearts could find in each other exactly what they needed to become whole. Eleanor often thought, in the quiet moments when she sat in the library that had witnessed so much of their journey, that she had been wrong about so many things when she was younger, wrong to believe that love was a trap designed to wound, wrong to think that hope was her enemy, wrong to imagine that a practical arrangement could never bloom into something transcendent. And she was grateful every day for the courage it had taken to accept Frederick's proposal, for the wisdom to watch his actions rather than merely listen for words he did not yet know how to speak, for the grace to let herself be loved by a man who showed his devotion in 1,000 small ways before he ever found the words to declare it. The white camellias in the garden grew more magnificent with each passing year, a living memorial to her mother and to the moment she had first understood that Frederick listened even when it seemed he did not, and sometimes she would walk among them with her daughter's small hand in hers, telling the child about the grandmother she had never known, and the flowers that had once grown in a modest garden at Briarwood before finding their true home here at Thornwood Park. Frederick remained devoted, fierce in his protection and tender in his affection. The cold Duke of Society's memory, now a distant legend, that made those who knew him smile with knowing fondness, and Eleanor never tired of watching him with their children, his large, gentle hands infinitely patient as he taught their daughter to ride or held their son through a fever, the man who had once sworn he could not love now overflowing with it, transformed by the choice he made new every day, just as his grandmother had promised. The camellia bracelet still circled Eleanor's wrist, its pearl warm against her skin. And sometimes when storms rolled across the countryside and thunder shook the windows of the library where they sat together, she would catch Frederick's eye and see him smile, both of them remembering the night when everything had changed, when he had finally spoken the words that set them both free. She had learned, in the end, that the distance between hope and despair was not as fixed as she had once believed, that a heart carefully guarded could still be gently opened, that love was not a single moment of declaration, but a lifetime of choosing, again and again, to see and be seen, to know and be known, to hold and be held through every storm. And if you have journeyed with Eleanor and Frederick through these pages, if you have felt your own heart quicken at their first touch and ache at their confessions, and soar at their triumph, then perhaps you too believe that such love is possible, that somewhere in the vast and complicated world there is someone who will listen even when it seems they do not, who will plant gardens for your grief and defend you against every cruelty, who will choose you not despite your wounds, but because of the strength they have given you. Thank you for walking this path with them, and may your own story be filled with white camellias and summer storms and the quiet, fierce, unwavering devotion of a love that grows stronger with every passing year.